Hey guys, welcome back to this quick tip series about the best exercise to develop each muscle group. The first video, which is linked in the comment section below, in the description below, was about the best exercises for pectorals. Today, we will look at the best exercises to optimize back development. Now, I want to just make sure that you understand that the back is a much more complex group to train than the chest, for example, or the deltoids, because, well, there's a lot more than one muscle composing the back. Talking in terms of the back, it's kind of like talking in terms of the front. And the front would include the delt, would include the chest, would include the biceps. So that's kind of like, but just for simplicity's sake, we will talk about the back as a general unit, but divided into two different broad categories, which is the muscle composing the width of the back, which would be the lats and the teres, and the muscle composing the thickness of the back, the traps, the mid traps, and the real delts, for example, the rhomboids. So let's look at what are the best exercises to use if you want to maximize back growth. Just like with the chest recommendations we saw earlier, the best exercises for you will depend on two things. First, your body type. People with short limbs will not respond to the same exercises as people with long limbs, for example. The best strategy will be different for both type of individuals. And then also the hypertrophy mechanism you're using. If you want to use muscle damage, mTOR activation, as your main stimulus, then you will need to rely on different exercises than if you want to rely on metabolic factors like accumulation of lactate, accumulation of growth factors. On one side, you want to use more big basic lift, heavier loading when you put the stretch on the target muscle group, so full range of motion. Whereas if you want to maximize the metabolic factors, it's more important to keep the muscle under constant tension over the whole range of motion than actually stretching that muscle under heavy load. Okay, so it will be different. So just by the same thing, you cannot use the same number of reps for both type of exercise. That is very important. If you have a program and you have a bench press, for example, and a cable fly, you should not use the same number of reps, the same number of sets, the same rep speed. So to optimize your training, you need to optimize the loading parameters to the exercise you're doing. So if we look at body type, the first thing, again, we saw this earlier with the pectoral video, but I will repeat that with every single one of these videos because it's important to understand. Now, long limb individuals, so the length of your arms from fingertip to fingertip will be longer than your height. That would be longer limbs. Now, when it comes to the pulling muscles, the lats will be at an advantage versus the other muscle composing the back. On the other end of the spectrum, when you have your traps, it will be much harder to develop them when you have long limbs than the lats. The biceps will also be much harder. And we're not talking about biceps today because we're just talking about back. But when it comes to the pulling muscles, if you have long limbs, the lats will be very easy to stimulate. So you don't need to worry about compensation when it comes to building the lats. The rear delts and rhomboids will be a bit harder, and the traps will be much harder to develop. So you won't require as much direct work for the lats, isolation work for the lats. You will get plenty of lats growth from just any type of pulling movement. When you look at the short-limbed individuals, they will have a much harder time stimulating that lat muscle to grow. It's very hard for them to get wider back. They will always compensate with the other back muscle, like the rear delts, like the rhomboids, the trap, the middle traps, and even the upper traps when they were doing rowing or pulling movements. So it's very easy for them to grow bigger traps, especially if they have narrow clavicle, build the rhomboids, get that thick back. But it's much harder to target those lats because as soon as they can compensate with other muscle groups, they will. So they will need a strategy emphasizing more isolation work for the back. But they don't need as much isolation work for the rear delts, the rhomboids, and the traps because these muscles respond very easily to training. And if anything, they respond too much. So what is training strategy? We saw that in the pectoral video, but I'm going to repeat it because it's important to understand, because the exercise you select also influence how many reps you're doing, how many sets you're doing, and what tempo you're using. So if you shoot for muscle damage, so you're using heavier load, stretching that muscle while it's under maximum tension. For that method to work, it's more important to focus on a full range of motion where the target muscle group is the one being stretched the most. So you want actually to have lots of tension when the muscle is fully elongated. Whereas with the metabolic factor, it's the opposite. You want to make sure that you stay under constant tension. So the contracted position is actually more important than the stretch position. You don't even need to reach a full stretch position when you're shooting for maximizing those metabolic factors. With the muscle damage, it will be heavier, lower reps, metabolic factor, lighter, with higher reps, longer duration. So if we look at the best exercises, the best training strategy for your back, if you have long limbs, I would go with, when it comes to the muscle damage, 2 horizontal row and 1 vertical pull. Okay, because for you, lats, very easy to develop. They will work with any type of pulling, even with vertical or horizontal pulling. In fact, if you have long limbs, you might not even need to do any vertical pulls at all, because you will get full back development from any horizontal rows. So options you can use. You can go with a closed grip, supinated chin up. Now, if you have short limbs, I would stay away from the closed grip, supinated chin up, because it will work your biceps a lot more. But because longer limbs individuals have a harder time building their biceps, that's not an issue. So I would use that, which is a stronger grip than the pronated grip, allowing them to overload the muscle more. You can also go with lat pull down with. But honestly, any vertical pull exercise will work fine. Now, with the horizontal movement, you would go with bent over row with a pronated grip, seated row with a neutral grip, chest supported dumbbell row, T-bar row. Anything will work because they will not overcompensate with the rhomboids, with the rear delts, with the upper traps. So any type of horizontal row movement will actually work the back in a pretty balanced way. If there's one thing you will notice with long limb lifters is that normally they have a pretty darn good back. That is normally the one part of their body that responds the best at training. Look at swimmers, they all have long limbs and they also have all good backs. Now, from the isolation work, metabolic factor, they would use 1 trap and 1 mid-back movement because these regions will be harder to develop for them. So they could go with any one of these movements. For the mid-back, they could go with a reverse pec deck, so the rear delts on the pec deck machine. They could go with face pulls. They could go with chest-supported rear delt exercises. When it comes to trap, any form of shrugs would work. The Kirk shrug, dumbbell shrug, barbell shrug, whatever. You can also do upright row. Upright row is an exercise that catch another bad press because it's hard on the shoulder, but not if you do it the right way. The right way to do upright row is with a shoulder width grip, and you only row to the bottom of your sternum, no higher. But you focus on pulling with your traps. To do that, you keep the bar as close to your body as possible, and you focus on shrugging before you're pulling. That's actually a very good way to build your traps when you have longer limbs. So that's the strategy I use with long limb lifters, more focus on horizontal pulling and isolation work to support mid-back and traps. You don't need isolation work for the lats because they will grow just fine from the big basic lift. If you have short limbs, different strategy. You need to emphasize the vertical pull a lot more than the horizontal pull because every horizontal movement will focus mostly on those back thickness muscle. It's very hard for a short limb individual to feel those lats working during horizontal row movement. It's possible, but you need to focus on pulling the elbow toward the hip joint, not just pulling horizontally. If you pull horizontally and you go straight back with your elbow, it will all be mid-back. You really need to pull down and back if you are short limb individual and you want to focus on those lats muscle during horizontal movement. Vertical pulls, well, they will have a greater chance of hitting those lats because it's much harder to compensate with other muscle during the vertical pull. With people with shorter limbs, I would recommend not leaning back on vertical pulls. If you have long limbs, I would actually recommend slightly leaning back to use more weight. But if the person with short limbs lean back when doing vertical pulls, they will start to compensate with other muscle groups and understimulate the lats. We don't want that. So shoulder width pronated pull-ups. Normally you want to go pronated when you have short limbs, not to compensate to the biceps too much. Or go with the lat pull down, or you can go with seated row, but by leaning forward, which I call motorcycle rowing. So you go a regular seated row, pronated grip, and you lean forward as much as possible, and you keep that forward lean during the whole movement, and you try to pull toward your hip crease, at hip joint. Once again, to focus more on the lats. And by leaning forward, the more forward you lean, the more you take out the mid-back. The more backward you lean, the more you involve that mid-back region. For horizontal rowing motion, I would go with the Pendlay row. So the back is parallel to the floor at all times, and you row to the lower portion of your abdomen, or even more so toward the hip joint. And you can also use a chest-supported row. Every type of horizontal row, when you have short limbs, pull toward that hip joint, not just straight back. Now, I would use, when it comes to metabolic factor exercises or isolation movement, I would go strictly with lats movement. So any type of straight arm pull downs, dumbbell or bar pullover, a pullover machine if you have one, which is literally for short limbs individual, the best machine ever invented. If I were to build like the ideal gym and I was only allowed 1 or 2 machines, I would go with the pullover, the original Nautilus pullover machine, and probably either a reverse hyper or a leg curl machine, because you can't really duplicate those machines efficiently with free weights. You can also use the kayak row, which you can find on the internet very easily. So really focus on the lats muscle if you want to make the ideal physical development if you have short limbs. So these are my recommendations if you want to maximize your back. Once again, the best exercises for your friend might not be the best exercises for you. Lever and methods play a huge role in which exercises you do. If you want to maximize your result, look into those movements. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.